After using the Viltrox 13mm f1.4 lens for client work, here's what works, what doesn't, and should you get one for your setup. I'm Eric, I shoot videos for a living, and I share what works for me. This is Viltrox Prime 13mm f1.4 lens for APS-C cameras. Having a 13mm on a crop sensor camera turns it into about 20mm lens, which is wide enough for about 99% of projects, and to be honest, I don't like to go any wider because then it seems a bit more distorted. And 20mm focal length is a very natural look, and it's wide enough to capture pretty much anything you will ever need on most of the shoots. When I started my video production business, I've used primarily the FX30, and at the beginning I struggled to find the lens that's gonna be wide enough and fast enough, because FX30 struggles with low light, to cover some of the projects where I needed the wide look. And this is where I found the lens from Viltrox. I often find myself in scenarios where I need to get a low light shot of a person in a very close quarters, and this lens comes in clutch every single time. Let's talk about the strong sides of this lens, and first of all, as I mentioned before, it's a wide angle lens. So this lens is really versatile because it's so wide. You can use it in offices, interiors, gyms, events, you name it, you can use it. It's wide, but it's not to the point where it's extreme, where it distorts the image. And because of the f1.4, you can shoot in quite dark scenarios. If you're shooting in a gym and you haven't got external lights, you will be totally fine with the f1.4. Especially if you're filming people, it's important that their faces doesn't get distorted. And this lens, even though it's wide, is not too wide to the point where it distorts any of the faces. I've never had an issue or any client complaints about distortion on the faces or anything like that. And I've used this lens on brand work, on interviews, on you name it. I've used it on most of the projects where I needed a wide lens, and I've never had any issues with it. Having f1.4 on APS-C sensor is huge. It gives you real flexibility in low light situation, especially if you're filming with something like an FX30 where it has dual base ISO and you want to keep it at 800 or 2500 for the best result. This lens comes in clutch with the f1.4. But pretty much any APS-C camera will benefit from a fast prime lens, as most crop sensor cameras are struggling with low light, and that's when you want fast lenses to get the best result possible. Even though it's an APS-C lens, it does come with professional features that you would get on more expensive high-end lenses, like an aperture ring, which is very important if you are filming, and if you really don't want jerky adjustments of your aperture, it does come with a smooth aperture ring. You don't have the same controls of the aperture ring like you would on the higher end lenses. However, it's nice of them to put it on the budget lenses, because I still use it, even though it's not as good as it would be on high-end lenses, but it does the job. And the other great feature is the build quality of this lens. As you can guess, I also dropped this. I dropped most of my equipment, and yes, I've dropped this lens, and it's totally fine still. It's mainly built from aluminium, so it's a very sturdy metal feel lens. This lens doesn't feel cheap, and it doesn't look cheap because of the aluminium body, which is a big up for Viltrox for doing that, because some lenses that I've tested with APS-C cameras that were on cheaper end, they were very plasticky, very fidgety, and they didn't look that great. This lens looks the par and does great the job. It's also a really small lens for f1.4. They put it into quite a compact size, which fits easily into the backpack. It doesn't take much space whatsoever. It's very neat on your rig. So if you are moving in tight spaces, you won't have any issues moving around with this lens. The other huge thing for me with this lens was the fact that even though it's a 13mm lens, you can still throw on an ND filter. It has a filter thread, and that was a big selling point for me, because I do like to keep my shutter at the correct angle when I'm filming. It's a quite small filter thread, it's a 67mm filter thread, Most of my lenses are full frame lenses, as I mentioned before in my previous videos. So most of my filters are 77 or 82mm thread. I just bought some extra step-up rings and I've used my over filters on this lens. However, what I realized is if you are gonna put like an 82mm filter on the 67mm thread, you might get a bit of bokeh on your shots when you are closing the ND filter. So that's something to keep in mind. Maybe it's worth investing into the 67mm thread like I did after realizing that I do have a bit of vignetting when I'm stepping down with my bigger ND filters. So overall, this lens is a very strong competitor when it comes to wide angle lenses for APS-C cameras. And I've been using it for 2 years now and I've been having insane results and I've been happy with what it produces most of the time. However, let's talk about the downsides of this lens. Let's start with the fact that it doesn't have inbuilt stabilization in the lens. And if you are shooting a lot of handheld content and maybe your camera doesn't have great inbuilt stabilization in the camera and then the lens doesn't have inbuilt stabilization, you might get really shaky footage. If you have like an FX30, it has great inbuilt stabilization and to be honest I haven't had any issues with it. Even though I've mentioned that f1.4 was the strong side of this lens, there is also a little caveat to it. When you are shooting at f1.4, the edges of the shot might be quite soft. Depends on what look you're going for. If you're going for a very sharp look, you might want to close down the aperture. At like f2, f2.8, it's getting sharp all around. At f1.4, the edges do get a bit soft. You usually do expect that from wide lenses and fast lenses. So yeah, it's a downside. However, in my line of work, it didn't really affect it that much. And I always prefer the soft look overall. I feel like that looks better. It doesn't look too processed or digital. But that's something for you to keep in mind. There are 2 more things I wanted to mention with this lens. That is, it does not have a weather seal. So if you are shooting a lot of stuff outside in, weather or rainy conditions or anything like that, you have to be mindful that this lens does not have a weather seal. Last and foremost is the autofocus. It's not a Sony native lens. So obviously because of that, it's not gonna be great autofocus as comes. But even comparing to like a Sigma, which is also a third-party lens, this autofocus doesn't come close. I would say 80 to 90% of the shots are great, but that 20 to 10%, it does come with some issues. I did experience on multiple shoots where it was focus breathing or losing focus for no good reason. But like I said, for the most part, the autofocus is good enough for what you want to do. Especially if you're using a sensor fix for focus or anything like that, or like zones, you should be fine. If you are using the whole sensor for autofocus, that's when it struggles the most. So that's something to be mindful of. So who's this lens for? If you are an APS-C user, this lens is great and it will cover you for most of the projects where you need wide shots. Or even if you're doing vlogs, travel content or anything like that, this lens has you covered. It's not a flashy lens, but it's a practical one, especially for the price. So you can pick one up for around £440 and that's a bargain in my opinion. For the focal length, for the aperture and for everything that this lens has to offer, this is a great deal. There is a reason it stayed in my kit for so long, because I'm really happy with the results and that's what actually matters. And it's extremely practical and yes, it has its own downsides like anything else. However, those downsides get outweighed by the upsides of this lens. I will leave some links down below if you want to pick one up for yourself. But for now, if you want more real-world videography advice from someone who's actually doing the work, consider subscribing. Keep creating and I'll see you in the next one.